Welcome to my course, Game Development Basics, Week 6, Lesson 3, Introduction to Structures. In this lesson, we'll define a struct in Unreal Engine, we'll explain some common uses of a structure, and then I'll demonstrate creating a struct in Unreal Engine. A struct is not unique to Unreal Engine, but it may be called different things depending on what programming language you're using. But in Unreal Engine, a struct or structure is a single variable that contains multiple variable declarations. And the purpose of this is that you can easily declare related or nested variables through a single container. Now, we've already been using some structs in our games. For instance, vectors, rotators, and transforms are all a struct that hold multiple values for x, y, and z. They can also be used for attributes or stats or holding various parameters. And we've also seen another struct when we're talking about the hit result. The hit result has multiple variables that are all nested together, and that way you can pass one variable type that has all the information you need. We can also create a struct to hold various parameters. For instance, if we're passing gameplay data into a level upon load, and we want all of that to be loaded at the same time, we can just pass it through as a struct. If you want to know more information about structs, I highly recommend reading the documents about Blueprint structs. There's a lot more information in here, but what we'll do in our lesson is I'm going to go ahead and show you how to create a Blueprint struct in Unreal Engine. And I think a good use for this that we can start with is by creating a loot table. And we're going to be using multiple structs in this project, but for the first one, I want to set up a way to track all of the possible loot that the player can collect. So I want to tidy up this a little bit. I'm going to create a new folder in our Blueprints folder called Loot. And I'm going to go ahead and take our currency and our loot base, and I'll just go ahead and drag those in here. And that way they're both in the same folder. And I'm going to create a struct that we can use to pass various information about our loot. So here I'll right click, and then where it says blueprints, you'll notice that one of these are structure. Now the common prefix for structs in Unreal Engine is F. So I'm going to call this F_loot struct. And if we open this up, we'll see that we have two things. Our structure, which allows us to set the various variable types, and then there is the default values. I like to be able to see both these at the same time, so I'm actually going to drag this to the bottom, and that way I can see my structure and then the default values for that. And because this is going to be a loot struct, I'm going to start by creating the first value, which is going to be loot name. And I can set the variable type to a string. And down here, notice that my default value has now changed this to a string where I can set in a default value. I can add another variable, and I can change the type to something else. Let's call this an integer. And let's say in our game that loot can be traded in. So you can maybe type in something like trade-in value, or whatever else you wanted. And we can continue to add multiple variables to this, and all of them would be contained in a single variable. Here in our loot base, we can add a new variable and call it loot struct. And now the variable type of loot struct will be an available variable that we can choose from. And if we drag this out and get it, we can see that the pin is blue and that we're able to break our loot struct and see the various variables here in our blueprint. So structures are a very valuable resource that we can use when we want to set multiple variables and pass them through as one variable type. Now, for my game, I want the loot to be various weapons that can be dropped by the enemies when they're destroyed. So I won't need this trade-in value variable. Instead, I want to set the variable type to a BP loot base, and I'm going to call this loot class. And this will allow me to set various classes for the weapons that we want to allow in the game. And here in my loot base, we can see that that has already updated to show the new variables that we have in that structure. But one thing I'd like to do is I'd like to set up a list of all of the available classes in a type of loot table. And for this, what we'll actually use is a data table, and we'll talk about that in the next lesson.